Stuff means stuff. Everything means something. And I don't just mean like everything means something in terms of, oh, there's a lamp. It means a lamp. Look, that's the object and that's the name it has. No, I mean, even a lamp, and that's just literally what I picked because I'm looking at it here in my office. Even that has connotations, like if the lamp is off and there is no light, that means darkness and confusion. But stuff means stuff. And so if the lamp is on, it means illumination, and lamps tend to not be the brightest form of light that we have in a household. So it's a little drop of light in an otherwise sea of darkness. That means something. It has connotations. There's a YouTube channel that I like to watch where they review movies and do a lovely job. And they're fond of making the point that, like, you might not have caught it, but your brain knows. Your brain knows that stuff means stuff. Good authors, directors, writers, musicians, orators, they understand that stuff means stuff. You are an expert in stuff meaning stuff. In the overt ways and in the subtle ways, you catch those things because you have as much experience in life as an interpreter of the world around you as you do have experiences with anything else at all that we do. And so stuff means stuff applies to geography. We have talked about this before. San Francisco, California means something very different than Nashville, Tennessee. Small town, rural Oklahoma means something very different than Paris, France. And Paris, France in 2021 means something very different than Paris, France in the 13th century. Locations carry meanings. They carry stories with them. And sometimes that location has enough history, enough meaning built into it, either in fiction or in history, that the mere mention of that and understanding all of that swirling whirlwind of stories and meanings that surround that location, that can help you understand what the characters are thinking, what it would have meant to an original audience. And I think what we are looking at in Matthew chapter 21 definitely falls into that category. You got this little village of Bethany that gets just a passing mention here in Matthew chapter 21 after Jesus cleanses the temple and has an uncomfortable exchange with the religious leadership. He bails out of Jerusalem, which is swollen with travelers right now, much like Memorial Stadium in Lincoln, Nebraska, the third biggest city in the state on game day. And so Jesus is not going to stay in Jerusalem. He's staying out of town. But is that just because space was hard to come by? Or does it mean something? Like at the very beginning of Jesus' life, space was hard to come by, and he ended up staying with his family on his first night in a manger, in some cave somewhere, some stable somewhere in Bethlehem, again, just outside of Jerusalem. But why was that? Was it just because of crowding, or did it mean something? Well, obviously, come on, you've done Christmas. It means something. It matters. It communicates a point to the original audience, through the audience, through the ages. It matters for his ticking of boxes of the messianic predictions surrounding him. And what I'm trying to argue here is that I think Bethany means something, and I think it's more than just things were crowded and this is where the overflow traffic went. I think this means something. So what do we know about Bethany? Well, from outside the Bible, we know that Bethany dates to a few hundred years before the time of Jesus, maybe as many as 500 to 600 years before the time of Christ. We know it was not big. We're not 100% exactly sure which teeny tiny little set of foundations that have been built on top of over the centuries is definitely Bethany, but we got a pretty decent guess, because some important Bible stuff happened in Bethany. And as a result, over the first few centuries after the time of the New Testament, pilgrims and local Christians would go to these important sites, and they would either find, using cultural memory or basic research, the exact location where a thing happened. We feel pretty good, for example, about the location of the Sermon on the Mount near Capernaum. Or they would go to a place that fits the description and seems like, well, that would probably be the place where it happened, even though there wasn't a ton of evidence or cultural memory there, as is the case of the tomb in Bethany, where Lazarus was purported to have been buried for, well, just a little while in John chapter 11. More on that in just a minute. Based on the location of that particular cave, that shrine where churches were built, there's a decent chance that we have a clear sense of precisely where Bethany is to this day. And where Bethany is to this day seems to line up pretty directly with what we get in John 11. I found it. John 11:18. It says, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Assuming we are talking about the right historical location, and as I mentioned, the evidence seems to point that way, it means that Bethany is just on the other side of the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. So way back in the day, better part of 2 miles, 1.71 miles is what I think the estimate I read was. Yeah, it's far enough to be two distinct communities. Maybe by the time we get to Jerusalem, this is functioning more like a suburb. But some historians and Bible scholars theorize that Jerusalem might not have grown right in around Bethany like a normal big city would with a little suburb or bedroom community on the edge of it. And the reason for that is because of some theories about why Bethany might have existed, what role that it served. Now, there's debate about whether Bethany is best understood as being a Hebrew name in two parts or an Aramaic name in two parts, or some sort of hybrid of these two languages. The time frame that Bethany came to even mild prominence during would make it possible that either of those explanations work. But there's some hints buried in the name there that suggest that this might have been a place where the sick were gathered. Some people theorize that the Essenes sent their lepers and their sick to Bethany to receive care or just to live out their days. I've read the credible suggestion that this was a place where people could go to do their required charity. And if this indeed was a place where you could go to do your charity, to pay your alms or your donations, that would mean that there would be people there who were in need. And so it is possible that Bethany is a place where people went to die. People went for what we would call in a modern sense hospice care. It would also mean that Bethany would have to be separated from all other dwellings by, what was it, like 600 feet? At least 600 feet, I think, was the required amount for cleanliness purposes. If you put lepers in there, you can't have other people close because of medicinal common sense, as well as the regulations laid down in the Old Testament for clean and unclean and the civil laws regarding what you do with people who have certain afflictions of the skin. So that would mean that Bethany was a place of mercy, but Bethany was also a place where you got to be really careful if you trot in there for a little while, because you could very easily come away unclean, and it could have a reputation as a place where you maybe want to stop by as a tourist with your 10-foot social distancing poles going in all directions, but you wouldn't want to stay there or set up shop, especially during Passover week, because of the risk of you becoming unclean and not getting to participate in all of the religious elements of the Passover because you got too close to the wrong person or touched the wrong surface or interacted with somebody the wrong way, and now you're ritually unclean. I mean, that risk would be huge. So it might just be that Bethany was a place that had plenty of lodging because it just wasn't somewhere that you would want to go. All of this is a little bit speculative, but without getting into every single thing, there's good reason to believe all of this stuff. And some of that good reason just has to do with even stuff we see in the Bible. I referenced John 11 a little bit earlier, and John 11, as we all might remember from Sunday school, has the claim to fame of having the shortest verse in the Bible. That's the one, John 11:35, Jesus wept. Why is he weeping? Well, because somebody he loves, Lazarus, has died, and he's died in Bethany. And Mary and Martha, those are the sisters of Lazarus, they send word to Jesus, and they're like, Lazarus is sick, come on. And Jesus is like, I'm doing something. He gets there, but he gets there later than they wanted him to get there. And they're like, if you'd been here, you could have saved him. And Jesus is like, no, he will rise again. And Martha's like, I know he will on the last day at the resurrection. And Jesus makes one of his big, famous 7 I am God proclamation statements that he makes in the book of John right at this point, where he famously says, I am the resurrection and the life, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And then he asks her, do you believe this? And she's like, yes, I do believe this. And then Jesus calls forth Lazarus, like just raises a dude from the dead, demonstrates that he has authority even over death. If this miracle happened in a place that was set aside, a place that meant dignified death and the opportunity for the living to lightly interact with that, to remind themselves of where they are headed, and to do something merciful toward those who are headed in that direction more quickly, then the meaning becomes even more significant. A place associated with death and sickness and all the things that are broken about the body and humanity becomes associated with life and the defeating of death. John arranges Jesus' raising of Lazarus from the dead and another visit to Bethany right next to each other in chapters 11 and 12, but it looks like John is skipping a bunch of details that happened in between there. Matthew has Jesus going during the Passion Week here, a few chapters down the road that we'll go and look at, back out to Bethany where he's staying during this whole week, and he's at the house of a guy named Simon the leper. That is in keeping with all the stuff that we were just talking about in terms of what Bethany means as a place. And there is the famous anecdote where Mary anoints him with oil, and there's some controversy about the cost of all of that. And like I said, we're going to get to that more down the road here. But the fact that the next time Bethany comes up, it is in the context of, again, someone who is or was unclean, and Jesus being there freely instead of in the much more fancy, definitely clean, swanky downtown Jerusalem during Passover festival season thing. All of that means stuff. And that really is just my entire point today. Thank you for talking about history and geography and ancient culture and things like this with me. I really like these kind of episodes, and I'm always nervous. I'm always like, oh, I hope people aren't bored because of all of that stuff. And then whenever I say that, a whole bunch of you are like, what? No, it's fun. Go ahead and do it. So I'm taking you up on that. Thank you for engaging with me on that stuff. I think it's a blast. We'll move forward in the narrative on Matthew 21 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.